workers, labourers, and all who toil beneath the shadow of another man's profit. Hear me, you wake before dawn. You surrender your hands, your backs, your minds to the machine. You return home hollowed out, with barely enough strength to eat, to sleep, and to begin the cycle again tomorrow. And yet you are told you are free, free to work, free to starve, free to choose between one master or another. This is the grand illusion of capitalist civilization, and today we shall tear it apart, brick by deliberate brick. The moment you accept a wage, you enter into an arrangement that presents itself as fair, mutual, and voluntary. Two parties, the employer and the worker, meet in the marketplace and strike a deal. You offer your capacity to labour, he offers compensation in return. On the surface, this transaction appears balanced, even civilized. Even civilized. The bourgeois economists celebrate it as the crowning achievement of modern freedom. No chains, no feudal obligation, no master with a whip. Simply two free individuals exchanging value for value. But strip away the legal language, the polite handshakes, and the ideological decoration, and what you find underneath is a system of extraction so elegant in its concealment that most of its victims defend it as justice. The first deception lies in what is actually being sold. You do not sell your labour to the capitalist. Labour, in the truest sense, is action. It is the living, breathing process of human creative energy applied to the world. What you sell is your labour power, your potential to work, your capacity to produce, packaged and surrendered for a fixed number of hours at an agreed price. This distinction is not merely philosophical, it is the wound through which your life quietly bleeds into another man's ledger. Because once that labour power is purchased, once you step through the factory gate and the clock begins, what you produce is no longer yours. It belongs entirely to the man who bought your capacity to produce it. Now the capitalist must determine what to pay you, and here the market is ruthless in its logic. Your wage is not calculated according to how much you produce, nor according to the value you generate, nor according to any measure of human need or dignity. Your wage is calculated according to the cost of reproducing your labour power, the food that keeps you standing, the shelter that keeps you returning, the bare minimum required to maintain you as a functional instrument of production. Capitalism does not pay you as a human being. It pays you as a machine requires fuel, precisely enough to keep running, and not a drop more than necessity demands. But here is where the architecture of theft reveals its true genius. Your labour power, once set in motion, does not merely reproduce its own value. It creates more value than it costs. Suppose the cost of maintaining you, your food, your rent, your clothing, equals 4 hours of labour. In 4 hours of work you have produced the equivalent of your own wage. The capitalist has recovered every penny he advanced to you, but the working day does not end at 4 hours. It continues 6, 8, 10, 12 hours, and every hour beyond that point of equivalence generates what Marx precisely identified as surplus value. That surplus belongs entirely to the owner of your labour power, which is to say, it belongs to the man who purchased you for the day. You receive nothing for it. No acknowledgement, no share, no portion of the wealth your additional hours brought into existence. This surplus value is not a bonus, not a reward for entrepreneurial courage, not the natural fruit of ownership. It is unpaid labor. It is hours of your life transformed into capital without your compensation and without your consent, hidden behind the perfectly legal fiction that you agreed to the terms. And you did agree, because the alternative was to agree with another employer on identical terms, or to face the slow violence of destitution. Freedom, under this arrangement, is the freedom to choose your exploiter. What makes this machinery so devastatingly effective is its invisibility. The feudal serf knew precisely which days he laboured for his lord, and which days he laboured for his lord, and which days he laboured for himself. The division was visible, spatial, undeniable. But the wage worker labours under a seamless veil. The entire working day appears paid. Every hour seems compensated. The wage covers the whole, and so the theft within it disappears from view, absorbed into the apparent fairness of a signed contract and a weekly envelope. The exploitation does not announce itself. It hides in the most ordinary transaction of modern life, the payment of a wage, and it operates with the full blessing of law, custom, economics, and every institution arranged to make the unnatural feel inevitable. Before the factory existed, before the clock governed human movement, before the whistle divided your day into segments owned by another, time belonged to a different logic entirely. The peasant worked according to seasons, according to sunlight, according to the natural rhythm of task and rest. The craftsman set his own pace, shaped his own hours, moved between labour and life without a supervisor, measuring the space between them. This is not romanticism. Those worlds carried their own brutalities and their own deprivations, but within them existed something that industrial capitalism has systematically and deliberately destroyed: the worker's organic relationship with his own time, his own energy, his own existence, as something more than a productive unit on a ledger sheet. Capital arrived and immediately understood, with the cold instinct of a predator, that time was the primary territory to be conquered. Not land alone, not resources alone, not machinery alone, but the hours of the human day, the minutes of the human life, the very texture of conscious existence as experienced by those who must labour to survive. Because capital's hunger is not satisfied by what you produce in a reasonable span of effort. Capital's hunger is structural, relentless, and mathematically predictable. Every additional hour you labour beyond the reproduction of your wage is surplus value flowing upward. Therefore, every additional hour is, from the perspective of capital, desirable. The extension of the working day is not cruelty for its own sake. It is the logical, inevitable appetite of a system whose survival depends on the continuous expansion of extracted surplus. This is why the history of capitalism is inseparable from the history of the working day as a battlefield. The manufacturers of early industrial England did not accidentally work children 16 hours in the mills. The plantation did not accidentally extract labour from sun-up to sundown. These were not aberrations of individual wickedness, but expressions of systemic necessity, capital left entirely to itself, unknown, estranged by law or collective resistance, will push the working day to its absolute biological limit, to the point where the worker can no longer physically return to work, and sometimes beyond even that point, simply replacing the broken body with another drawn from the surplus population waiting hungrily at the gates. Marx observed with surgical precision that capital is indifferent to the health and longevity of the individual worker, because it does not depend on any individual worker. It depends on the working class as a whole, on the perpetual availability of labour power as a commodity. The individual labourer may be consumed, worn down, discarded. Capital will find another, This is why no appeal to the humanity or conscience of the individual capitalist can resolve the question of time. The most sympathetic employer operating within a competitive market is compelled by the logic of his position to extract maximum value from available labor hours or be destroyed by competitors who will. The battlefield of time is not won through the benevolence of owners, but through the organized, militant, and relenting resistance of workers. And when that resistance succeeded, when labor movements across Europe and America wrested legal limits on the working day through strikes, through sacrifice, through bodies placed between capital and its appetite, capital did not retreat. It adapted with extraordinary sophistication. If the absolute length of the working day could not be infinitely extended, then the intensity of labor within that day would be maximized instead. The machinery was accelerated. The pace of the assembly line was increased. Supervision tightened. Rest breaks narrowed. The same number of hours was made to yield greater and greater output, compressing more surplus value into a fixed span of time. What appeared as a victory for the worker was partially abso, read by capital's capacity to intensify exploitation rather than merely extend it. Beyond the factory floor, capital's colonization of time operates at the level of the entire social organism. The hours you spend commuting to produce someone else's profit are hours subtracted from your life. The exhaustion that follows you home, that empties your evenings of thought and your weekends of genuine rest, is not incidental but functional. A worker too tired to think critically, too depleted to organize, may be seized, too depleted to organize, too consumed by the recovery required for tomorrow's shift, is a worker who cannot effectively challenge the conditions of his own exploitation. Fatigue itself becomes a mechanism of social control, and the shrinking of your free time is simultaneously the shrinking of your political consciousness, your cultural life, your capacity to imagine and demand a world arranged differently than the one capital has constructed around you. There is a story that capitalism tells about itself with great enthusiasm and considerable theatrical skill. It is the story of progress, of human ingenuity conquering nature, of machines relieving mankind of brutal toil, of technology as the great equalizer that lifts all conditions and dignifies all labor. Every new invention is announced as liberation. Every advance in productive machinery is presented as a gift to civilization, a triumph of human reason over physical limitation. The industrialist stands before his spinning jenny, his steam engine, his automated loom, and declares that he has freed the worker from back-breaking drudgery, that he has multiplied human capacity beyond anything previous generations could have imagined, and in a purely technical sense he is not entirely wrong. The machine does multiply productive power. The machine does reduce the physical effort required to generate a given quantity of output. But what this triumphant narrative omits, what it cannot afford to acknowledge without unraveling itself, is the question of who owns the machine, who controls its application, and whose interests determine how its extraordinary power is deployed. Under capitalism, the machine does not belong to those who operate it. It belongs to those who purchased it with accumulated capital, which is to say, with previously extracted surplus value, with the congealed, crystallized labor of workers who were never fully compensated for what they produced. The machine is therefore not a neutral instrument of human progress placed at the service of all. It enters the productive process as the property of the capitalist class, and it serves first and always the interests of that class. This single fact transforms every promise of technological liberation into its precise opposite. into a new and more sophisticated instrument of worker dependency and control. Consider what the introduction of machinery actually accomplishes within the capitalist factory. Before the machine, the skilled craftsman possessed something of enormous value: knowledge. His hands carried technique accumulated over years of apprenticeship. His judgment, his experience, his intimate understanding of material and process gave him a degree of leverage in his relationship with the employer. He could not be instantly replaced. His skill was his shield, however thin, against the full weight of capital's demands. The machine arrives and systematically dismantles that shield. It transfers the knowledge, the technique, the judgment from the worker's hands and mind into the mechanism itself, into the fixed capital controlled by the owner. The worker is now required not to think but to tend, not to create but to monitor, not to exercise human mastery over material, but to serve the rhythms of a device that has absorbed and imprisoned the collective intelligence of his craft. He becomes an appendage of the machine rather than its master, and in becoming so, he becomes infinitely more replaceable, infinitely more vulnerable, infinitely more subject to the dictates of the man who owns what he tends. This deliberate descaling is not an unfortunate side effect of technological progress. It is, within the logic of capitalism, a strategic achievement. A workforce of interchangeable, low-skilled machine operators is a workforce that cannot easily withhold its labor, that cannot credibly threaten to take its irreplaceable knowledge elsewhere, that cannot organize from a position of productive indispensability. The machine, in reducing the skill required at the point of production, reduces the worker's bargaining power in almost perfect proportion. What appears as a simplification of labor is simultaneously a consolidation of power in the hands of those who own the instruments of that simplified labor. Furthermore, technology under capitalism introduces a permanent psychological terror that disciplines the workforce with extraordinary efficiency. The machine does not only replace skill, it replaces bodies. Every automated process, every labor-saving device introduced into the factory simultaneously threatens the employment of those it works alongside. Capital maintains what Marx identified as the Industrial Reserve Army, a mass of unemployed and underemployed workers whose existence exerts constant downward pressure on the wages and conditions of those currently employed. The machine feeds this reserve army by displacing workers faster than new industries can absorb them, and their desperate presence at the factory gates reminds every employed worker that his position is contingent, his wage negotiable downward, his complaints dangerous luxuries he cannot easily afford. The threat of replacement by either a machine or a hungrier human being is not incidental to capitalist production. It is one of its primary mechanisms of labor discipline, and technological advancement perpetually refreshes and enlarges that threat rather than diminishing it. What is perhaps most philosophically devastating about technology's role under capitalism is the profound inversion it represents of what human productive power could genuinely achieve. The accumulated scientific and mechanical knowledge of centuries, the extraordinary collective intelligence embedded in modern productive technology represents humanity's greatest practical achievement. Our capacity to shape the material world with increasing mastery and decreasing effort. In a rationally organized society, this technology would be the common inheritance of all, deployed to reduce necessary labor time for everyone, to expand the hours available for rest, for culture, for self-development, for the full flourishing of human potential that grinding toil has always suppressed. Instead, under the ownership structures of capitalism, it is captured as private property wielded as competitive advantage, and turned against the very class whose collective labor and collective knowledge made its existence possible in the first place. There is a particular kind of suffering that does not announce itself as suffering. It does not arrive with visible wounds or audible cries. It settles instead like sediment, slowly, almost imperceptibly, layer by layer, into the consciousness of those it afflicts, until what was once a violation of human dignity comes to feel like the simple, unremarkable texture of ordinary life. This is the deepest achievement of alienation under capitalism, not merely that it damages the worker, but that it damages him in ways he gradually loses the capacity to recognize as damage, in ways that feel so thoroughly so completely natural, so entirely inevitable, that to question them begins to seem like madness rather than clarity. The commodity system does not only exploit the worker's body, it colonizes his mind, reshapes his self-perception, and reshakes his understanding of what human existence is supposed to feel like, until the prison becomes indistinguishable from the world itself. To understand what alienation destroys, one must first understand what it separates the worker from, what it severs and removes from his conscious experience of being alive. Marx identified with devastating precision four distinct ruptures that capitalist production inflicts upon the human being who enters it as a laborer. The first is the separation from the product of labor. What your hands produce, what your mind contributes to, what your energy and hours bring into existence. It does not belong to you. It leaves your hands and enters the market as someone else's commodity, someone else's capital, someone else's accumulated wealth. You may have poured genuine skill and effort into its creation, yet you encounter it afterward, if you encounter it at all, as a stranger encounters an object, with no recognized relationship, no acknowledged authorship, no connection between your inner life and the thing your labor made real in the world. Repetition of this severance, day after day, year after year, produces a profound psychological consequence. The worker ceases to experience labor as meaningful self-expression and begins to experience it as something done to him rather than by him. The second rupture is from the act of labor itself. In its fullest human sense, labor is not merely the expenditure of physical energy. It is the conscious, purposeful transformation of the world according to human intention and imagination. It is what distinguishes human productive activity from the instinctive behavior of animals. The architect, Marx observed, builds the structure first in his mind before building it in reality. This capacity for conscious, creative, intentional transformation of the material world is one of the most distinctly human faculties we possess. Capitalist production systematically destroys it at the level of the individual worker. You do not decide what to produce, how to produce it, at what pace, in what manner, toward what end. Every significant decision has been made above you. By those who own the process, you merely execute. Your labor becomes compulsory rather than voluntary, externally directed rather than internally motivated, a means of survival rather than an expression of humanity. And labor, experienced as compulsion, as something endured rather than embraced, gradually poisons the worker's relationship with his own creative capacity, teaching him, through daily repetition, that his deepest human faculties are not his to exercise, but his to surrender. The third rupture tears at the relationship between worker and worker. Capitalism presents itself as a system of cooperation and mutual benefit, yet its actual operating logic sets worker against worker in continuous competition for wages, for positions, for the favor of employers, for bare economic survival. The solidarity that should naturally arise between people sharing identical conditions of exploitation is deliberately fragmented by this competition, reinforced by ideological divisions of nationality, ethnicity, religion, and gender that capital did not invent, but has always been extraordinarily willing to exploit and deepen. When workers cannot recognize their shared interests because they are too consumed by competition with one another for scarce resources controlled by those above them. Capital operates without its most dangerous natural opponent, the unified Class K, conscious working class that understands its collective power and is willing to exercise it. The fourth and most total rupture is from what Marx called our species being our consciousness of ourselves as members of a human community with shared capacities, shared potentials, and shared interests in the collective flourishing of our kind. The commodity system reduces every human relationship to the logic of exchange, every interaction to a transaction, every value to a price. When this logic thoroughly penetrates consciousness, the worker begins to evaluate himself as the market evaluates him, by his productive utility, his exchange value, his usefulness to the accumulation process. He internalizes the very measurements his exploiters use to assess him, and in doing so participates actively in his own diminishment, policing his own aspirations, limiting his own imagination, accepting his own disposability as a reflection of personal inadequacy rather than systemic design. There comes a moment in the life of every oppressed people when the accumulated weight of suffering reaches a threshold that mere endurance can no longer contain. It is the moment when scattered, individual pain begins to transform into something harder, something sharper, something capable of becoming historical force, rather than simply historical tragedy. But that transformation does not happen naturally, does not happen automatically, does not happen simply because the conditions of exploitation have become objectively unbearable, for they have always been unbearable, and unbearable conditions alone have never dismantled a single system of power in the entire recorded experience of human civilization. What transforms suffering into revolutionary consciousness, what converts the isolated grievance of the individual worker into the organized power of a class, is precisely the most difficult and most essential work that confronts the laboring masses. The work of recognizing themselves clearly and without illusion as a class with common interests, common enemies, and a common historical destiny that no individual escape can substitute for collective liberation. The bourgeoisie understood class before the workers did. They organized their interests through parliaments, through banks, through legal systems, through the ownership of press and pulpit and university, through every institution capable of shaping what the majority of people believe about the world they inhabit and their place within it. They constructed an entire civilization around the protection and perpetuation of their class interests, while simultaneously propagating the ideology that class itself does not meaningfully exist. That society is composed of individuals whose fortunes reflect their personal virtues and personal failures. That the worker who remains poor does so because of insufficient effort or insufficient intelligence rather than because of a system architecturally designed to concentrate wealth upward, regardless of individual merit or individual effort. This ideological achievement is perhaps the bourgeoisie's most consequential victory, not any particular law, not any particular military triumph, but the installation within working class consciousness of a framework that makes collective class identity feel less real, less legitimate, less morally serious than individual identity, national identity, religious identity, or any of the other categories of belonging that cut horizontally across the vertical line of class division and blur its clarity. This is why the first and most fundamental task of revolutionary organization is not the drafting of programs or the planning of actions, but the harder, slower, more intimate work of consciousness, of helping workers see themselves and their situation with the analytical clarity that the dominant ideology is specifically designed to prevent. A class that does not recognize itself as a class cannot act as a class. A workforce fragmented by competition, divided by nationality, separated by ethnicity, and taught to locate the source of its suffering in the cultural or racial characteristics of fellow workers rather than in the ownership structures above them, is a workforce that poses no fundamental threat to capital, regardless of how genuinely and deeply it suffers. Division is not an accident of working class life. It is a product, carefully maintained and periodically refreshed, of ruling class strategy, and recognizing it as such, stripping it of its apparent naturalness and exposing it as a manufactured instrument of domination, is where collective consciousness must begin. But consciousness alone, however clear and however widely shared, is insufficient without organization, without the construction of institutions, relationships, and forms of collective power capable of translating shared understanding into coordinated action that capital and the state it serves must actually reckon with. The trade union is a beginning, an essential beginning, the place where workers first practice the elementary discipline of solidarity, first discover that collective withholding of labor power has a force that no individual negotiation can approximate, first build the habits of mutual obligation and collective decision-making that more advanced forms of struggle will require. But the trade union that limits its ambition to the negotiation of better terms within the existing system, higher wages, shorter hours, improved conditions, while leaving untouched the fundamental ownership structures that make exploitation both possible and inevitable, addresses the symptoms of a disease while carefully avoid its cause. Better terms of exploitation are preferable to worse terms of exploitation, and no serious revolutionary dismisses the immediate material improvement of workers' lives as irrelevant. But they are not liberation, and confusing them with liberation is precisely the confusion that the system is most invested in encouraging. Because a workforce focused entirely on incremental improvement within the existing framework is a workforce that has, however unconsciously, accepted the permanent legitimacy of the framework itself. The system does not need to be negotiated with at its foundations. It needs to be replaced at its foundations, its ownership structures dismantled, its class relations abolished, its transformation of human beings into instruments of accumulation ended not through the goodwill of those who benefit from that transformation, but through the organized, determined, historically conscious power of those who have been subjected to it across generations of inherited dispossession and inherited struggle, whose full cost has never been honestly counted or adequately acknowledged by those who commanded it. The 5 pillars of this analysis: the disguised theft of the wage, the colonization of your time, the machine turned against its operator, the systematic destruction of human consciousness, and the absolute necessity of collective organization are not 5 separate grievances to be addressed independently, negotiated separately, or reformed one at a time, through the patient mechanisms of a system whose continued existence depends on none of them being fundamentally resolved. They are 5 expressions of a single, unified logic, the logic of capital, and they stand or fall together as a totality, which means that the response to them must be equally total, equally unified. equally unwilling to mistake the adjustment of symptoms for the cure of the disease that produces them. You have been told repeatedly and from every direction that power controls, that the system is imperfect but improvable, that its cruelties are correctable through the right legislation, the right leadership, the right appeal to the conscience of those who benefit most enormously from its continuation. You have been told to vote more carefully, to petition more eloquently, to demonstrate more peacefully, to wait more patiently for reforms that arrive slowly, partially, and are frequently reversed the moment the organized pressure that produced them relaxes even slightly. You have been told that the problem is this particular employer, this particular government, this particular policy, never the ownership structure itself, never the class relation itself, never the fundamental arrangement by which the many produce and the few accumulate what the many produce. Every institutional voice, every established authority, every respectable channel of permitted dissent directs your anger at everything except the root, because it is precisely the root that those voices exist to protect. History, ho! Weaver, is not governed by what the powerful find convenient to acknowledge. History is governed by the actual movement of material forces, by the contradictions that accumulate within systems until those systems can no longer contain them, by the moments when the organized power of the dispossessed becomes greater than the organized power of those who dispossess them. We are not the first generation to stand at such a moment, and the struggles of those who came before us, who fought for the 10-hour day and were called criminals, who organized the first unions and were called conspirators, who demanded the most elementary political rights and were called revolutionaries, as though the word were an accusation rather than a description of what the moment required. Those struggles live in every protection you currently possess and in every protection that has already been stripped away, demonstrating with brutal clarity that nothing won within this system is ever permanently secured as long as the system itself remains intact and its owners retain the power to reclaim what circumstance temporarily forced them to concede. The working class has been the most lied to, the most divided against itself, the most thoroughly educated in the acceptance of its own subordination of any class in human history, and it has still, repeatedly, across centuries and continents, found its way to moments of extraordinary collective power that shook the foundations of the established order and demonstrated, beyond any theoretical argument, that another arrangement of human social life is not merely desirable but materially possible. What has prevented those moments from becoming permanent transformations is not the absence of courage or the absence of suffering or the absence of justification. All of these have existed in overwhelming abundance. What has been insufficient historically is the depth and durability of class consciousness, the clarity of analysis that refuses to be satisfied with partial victories, and the organizational forms capable of sustaining collective power through the inevitable periods of defeat, repression, and manufactured despair that every ruling class deploys against those who seriously threaten its position. That clarity is what this analysis has attempted to provide. Not comfort, not the false reassurance that justice is inevitable or that history moves automatically toward liberation without the conscious, organized, determined intervention of those whose liberation is at stake, but clarity about where the theft occurs, about what territory is being fought over, about what the machine actually serves, about what has been done to your mind as well as your body, and about what the only path forward genuinely requires of you and of every person who shares your condition, regardless of the national borders, linguistic differences, and manufactured cultural antagonisms that capital has always used to prevent you from recognizing each other as what you fundamentally are, members of the same class, bearers of the same chains, and the only force in existence with both the interest and the potential power to remove them permanently from human history.